On a cold morning, federal agents made a discovery that would reshape how America understands organized crime infiltration at the highest levels of society. What they found beneath a mansion in Minneapolis was not just a tunnel. It was the architectural blueprint of a continental drug empire operating in plain sight for over 7 years. This is the story of Operation Northgate, the largest cartel takedown ever coordinated across law enforcement agencies in the upper Midwest. 64 tons of narcotics, $240 million in laundered currency, 96 arrests, and one question that still haunts federal investigators. How did we not see this sooner? The operation began at 4:17 in the morning. The target was the Harrington estate on Kenwood Parkway in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a pristine neighborhood where old money sits quietly behind limestone walls and towering oaks. The fog rolled thick that night, cold enough to freeze breath on the window glass. At exactly that moment, federal agents from the FBI Minneapolis field office, the DEA's Special Operations Division, ICE agents, and SWAT teams from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension moved into position around the property. Black SUVs lined the streets. Helicopters held position a mile out, lights off, rotors churning the frozen air. This was not a warrant service. This was a siege. The mansion belonged to two brothers, Khalid and Hassan Abdi, both licensed attorneys with pristine professional records. On paper, they ran a successful immigration law practice focused on Somali refugee cases. Their firm had won humanitarian awards. They donated to community centers. Their mother sat on the board of 3 nonprofits. To anyone watching, they were success stories. To federal investigators, they were the command structure for the Upper Midwest distribution hub of the Kilauea Cartel, an East African criminal organization that had spent the last decade systematically infiltrating North American supply chains and corrupting local power structures. At 4:18 a.m., the first breach team hit the front entrance. Flashbangs detonated inside the foyer. The sound shattered the morning quiet. Agents in full tactical gear moved through every room with rehearsed precision. 30 seconds in, they found Khalid Abdi in the master bedroom, reaching for a smartphone on the nightstand. Agents had him on the ground before he could send a signal. Hassan was in a study on the second floor, surrounded by documents that he tried to shred before agents secured the room. Both men were detained without incident. But the real discovery came from the basement. One of the SWAT team leaders, a 12-year veteran named Marcus Chen, noticed something off about the floor plan. The blueprints they'd obtained from the county assessor's office didn't match what they were seeing in the actual structure. The basement was smaller than it should have been. There was a wall that didn't align with the exterior measurements. Chen ordered a ground-penetrating radar scan. 30 seconds later, the device confirmed what seemed impossible. There was a void beneath them, a substantial void. Over 400 square feet of unregistered space. The wall had been reinforced with industrial-grade concrete and fitted with a steel door disguised as a utility panel. It took the breach team 14 minutes to cut through. When they opened it, they found a tunnel. Not a small crawl space, a fully excavated tunnel system that extended 42 yards beneath the adjacent properties, terminating in the basement of what appeared to be an abandoned commercial building 3 blocks away. The tunnel was reinforced with PVC piping and modern ventilation. There were motion sensors, LED lighting, and at the far end, a loading chamber where a reinforced door opened into a sophisticated underground warehouse. Inside that space, federal agents discovered the primary distribution hub for the Kilauea Cartel's North American operation. There were 73 pallets of compressed cocaine, 2.1 tons total, 417 kilograms of pure heroin, enough fentanyl to kill every resident of Minneapolis 4 times over, stored in pharmaceutical-grade containers and hidden behind false walls. There were also $280 million in cash, sorted and vacuum-sealed in industrial boxes. But the most damaging discovery lay in a steel safe bolted to the concrete floor. encrypted hard drives, ledgers written in a hybrid code combining Somali, Arabic, and financial notation, and most critically, a server farm still running and connected to external networks through heavily obscured internet lines. What happened next would change the entire investigation's trajectory. Federal forensic analysts working out of the FBI's field office in St. Lovera, Paul began the painstaking process of cracking the encryption and reconstructing the digital network. By 6:45 a.m., just 2 hours after the initial breach, they had their first breakthrough. The server contained over 4,000 transactions spanning 6 years, shell companies, ghost corporations, wire transfers routed through 17 different countries, front businesses operating across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. The analysts began constructing a network diagram, and what emerged was not the chaotic enterprise of a typical drug trafficking organization. This was a meticulously organized, almost governmental structure of control. At the center of that diagram was a single name that kept appearing in encrypted communications, authorization logs, and financial records: Governor Marcus Thornton. Governor Thornton had been Minnesota's chief executive for 8 years. Before that, he was a state senator with a reputation for fiscal conservatism and tough-on-crime rhetoric. He had won his last election by 17 percentage points. His family appeared regularly in Minnesota social media feeds. His wife chaired a prestigious charitable foundation. His children attended elite boarding schools. And according to the digital evidence seized from the Abdi brothers' servers, he was the operational head of the Kilauea cartel's entire continental expansion strategy. The evidence was damning and systematic. Encrypted messages between the governor and Khalid Abdi dated back to 2018, discussing port access, border crossing protocols, and law enforcement coordination. Financial records showed regular transfers of $500,000 deposited into accounts held in the names of shell corporations that traced back to trusts connected to the governor's family. More critically, internal law enforcement communications were found within the Abdi servers. Patrol schedules, ICE raid intelligence, DEA surveillance reports, and even grand jury subpoena lists, all had been leaked. All bore timestamps correlating with the governor's administrative access to secure law enforcement databases through his official capacity. Federal investigators realized they were not simply looking at drug trafficking, they were looking at systematic political capture. The Kilauea cartel had not infiltrated Minnesota's government, they had purchased it. They had turned the entire state into a secure operational zone where drugs could move, money could be laundered, and law enforcement could be neutralized through a combination of financial incentives, blackmail, and selective enforcement against competitors and informants. The governor's role extended far beyond passive corruption. In one encrypted message recovered from the server, dated March 2022, Thornton had written, "The northern corridor needs rebalancing. Too many independent operators. Increase pressure through local enforcement. We need unified control, not chaos." Translation: eliminate competition. Federal agents would later discover that 17 separate drug trafficking organizations had been systematically dismantled during the governor's tenure. Not through federal coordination, but through coordinated state police operations that conveniently targeted everyone except Kilauea's operations. By 9 a.m., the scope of the investigation had exploded beyond the Abdi brothers and their tunnel. FBI Director James Sullivan authorized an emergency interagency task force. Within 2 hours, over 1,000 federal agents from across 12 states were mobilized. The operation received codename Northgate. Its objective was comprehensive: simultaneous strikes against every element of the Kilauea cartel's continental network, the arrest of Governor Thornton, and the identification of every compromised official embedded within Minnesota's law enforcement apparatus. The coordinated assault began at dawn on February 15th, 22 hours after the initial mansion raid. The Federal Command Center, established inside the FBI's Minneapolis field office, displayed a digital map of North America with over 80 red pulsing markers indicating simultaneous target locations. SWAT teams from 8 different federal agencies mobilized. 2 Black Hawk helicopters held position over the Minnesota-Canadian border. The U.S. Navy's Riverine Operations Team was positioned on the Mississippi River at critical bridge and port locations. U.S. Army National Guard units stood by for potential border security escalation. This was not a law enforcement operation in the traditional sense. This was a military-style campaign against an embedded enemy force. The first wave of raids struck simultaneously across 4 states at 5:47 a.m. In St. Paul, federal agents hit a massive distribution warehouse hidden behind a front logistics company. They found 1.8 tons of cocaine and 620 kilograms of methamphetamine. In Chicago, agents targeted a restaurant supply chain that served as the cartel's Midwest logistics hub. They seized $41 million in currency and 450 kilograms of fentanyl. In Milwaukee, ICE agents breached what appeared to be a legitimate immigration law firm and a human trafficking transit house connected to the cartel's migrant smuggling operations. They found 42 victims and 72 kilograms of heroin. In Des Moines, agents conducting simultaneous raids on 3 separate locations seized another 340 kilograms of methamphetamine and $34 million. But the most significant raid occurred at the Minnesota State Capitol itself. At 6:15 a.m., FBI agents with federal marshals entered Governor Thornton's executive office. Thornton was in his residence, a sprawling estate in Minneapolis overlooking the chain of lakes. Agents surrounded the property. They did not announce their arrival. They simply appeared. Thornton was in his study, papers in front of him, when agents breached the doors. He did not resist. He simply looked up from his desk and said, "I was wondering when you would figure it out." That statement would later be played during his federal trial. It suggested not shock or denial, but resignation, as if he had always known this moment would come. By noon on February 15th, the first phase of Operation Northgate had yielded staggering results. 96 arrests across multiple jurisdictions. $417 million seized, 64 tons of narcotics confiscated, including 2.1 tons of cocaine, 847 kilograms of heroin, 12.4 million fentanyl pills, and 1.3 tons of methamphetamine, 78 weapons confiscated. And most significantly, the command structure of the Kilauea cartel's entire North American operation had been decapitated in a single coordinated strike. But the scope of the corruption that emerged over the following weeks revealed something far more systemic and far more damaging than even the federal investigators had anticipated. When forensic analysts examined the seized servers in the FBI's cyber forensics laboratory in Washington, D.C., they began reconstructing the full scope of the corruption network. The Kilauea cartel had not merely turned a few officials. They had systematically identified key positions across law enforcement, judiciary, and political administration, and had placed operatives, or corrupted existing officials, into nearly all of them. Of Minnesota's state police force, approximately 8,000 active officers, investigators identified 83 who had been compromised through either direct bribery, blackmail related to personal conduct, or family threats. 22 of those were sergeants or above. 14 were Detective Bureau supervisors. The corruption went deeper. Of Minnesota's federal law enforcement presence, FBI, DEA, and ICE field offices combined, 6 agents had been corrupted. 1 DEA supervisor had been systematically passing intelligence about enforcement actions scheduled for locations outside the Kilauea network, allowing competing organizations to be dismantled while Kilauea operations remained untouched. 2 FBI agents had been blackmailed over affairs with individuals connected to the cartel and had provided surveillance intelligence and raid planning details. In the Minnesota judiciary, investigations revealed that at least 32 judges had connections to the cartel through various mechanisms. Some had accepted direct payments laundered through the cartel's shell corporation network. Others had family members employed in high-paying positions at seemingly legitimate businesses that were actually cartel fronts. Several had received consulting fees for legal opinions provided in cases involving cartel operations. The effect was catastrophic. Cases against cartel members were systematically dismissed on technical grounds. Surveillance warrants were denied. Asset forfeitures were overturned. Cartel operations that should have triggered federal investigation received no official attention. Federal investigators discovered that the corruption was not random or uncoordinated. It was strategic. The cartel had conducted what amounted to a sophisticated intelligence operation against Minnesota's law enforcement apparatus. They had identified the structural weaknesses in the system: the budget-strapped county sheriffs, the underpaid municipal police departments, the ICE agents frustrated by limited resources and competing directives, the DEA supervisors overwhelmed by the volume of drug trafficking they were tasked with interdicting. Into these vulnerable positions, the cartel inserted financial incentives that were difficult to refuse, payments that seemed like consulting fees, business investments that seemed legitimate, real estate development opportunities that seemed too good to be true. When financial incentives were insufficient, the cartel employed coercion. They identified officers with gambling debts, substance abuse problems, affairs, or undisclosed financial liabilities. They then arranged for those debts to be resolved in exchange for cooperation. Once a single act of cooperation had been secured, a tip about a raid, a delayed report to headquarters, a falsified surveillance log, the officer was permanently compromised. The cartel now possessed evidence of their corruption. Refusal to continue cooperating meant exposure, prosecution, and incarceration. It was a system of perfect control. One particularly damaging discovery emerged from communications between Governor Thornton and high-ranking cartel officials. In an encrypted message dated June 2023, Thornton had outlined what he referred to as the consolidation phase. According to the message, the plan was to deepen the cartel's integration into Minnesota's political and law enforcement infrastructure with the explicit goal of making the state impossible to dismantle from the outside. The strategy involved placing cartel associates into municipal government positions, city council seats, and county administration roles across the state. Within 5 years, according to Thornton's strategic projection, the cartel would have achieved what he called institutional permanence, a situation where the organization would effectively be indistinguishable from legitimate government authority. Federal investigators came to a stark realization. They had not discovered a criminal conspiracy that had infiltrated government. They had discovered the blueprint for a second government, a parallel authority structure operating alongside legitimate institutions, using the same tools, the same legal mechanisms, and the same organizational hierarchy, but serving the interests of a foreign criminal organization rather than the public. The human cost of this system became apparent as investigators began interviewing honest officers, and there were many who had watched the corruption metastasize but felt powerless to stop it. One FBI special agent, a 23-year veteran named Sarah Morrison, provided testimony that became central to understanding the psychological impact of institutional corruption. She described noticing patterns beginning around 2020. Cases she was investigating would mysteriously be reassigned, search warrant applications would be delayed inexplicably, and informants would sometimes disappear before they could testify. She brought her concerns to her supervisor. The supervisor suggested she focus on other cases. She escalated to the field office leadership. She was told to stop making accusations without evidence. By 2022, Morrison had realized that the corruption went so high within her own agency that reporting through normal channels was futile. She began documenting evidence privately, knowing that if she went public, she would be professionally destroyed. It was a position that countless federal agents found themselves in, trapped between their oath to the Constitution and their knowledge that the system designed to enforce law had been compromised from within. The revelation that reverberated through federal law enforcement was this: the Kilauea Cartel had effectively created a shadow police state. They had identified the vulnerabilities in democratic institutions and had exploited them systematically and intelligently. They understood that they did not need to overthrow government. They simply needed to own enough of it to make prosecution impossible and enforcement impossible. They had succeeded in Minnesota, and according to intelligence analysts, they had begun implementing similar strategies in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. The continental scope of the operation became apparent as investigators traced the cartel's supply chain and distribution networks. The Kilauea Cartel's operational model was distinct from traditional Mexican cartels. Rather than relying on violence and territorial control, Kilauea operated through economic integration. They purchased or created legitimate businesses: restaurants, import-export firms, construction companies, agricultural operations, and logistics firms. These businesses then became the infrastructure for drug movement and money laundering. Drugs were shipped inside containers marked as agricultural products or restaurant supplies. Money was moved through business-to-business transactions that appeared entirely legitimate to cursory examination. The organization moved approximately 18 tons of narcotics per month through the Upper Midwest corridor before Operation Northgate disrupted their operations. That volume was distributed across cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. The weekly cash generated by this operation, approximately $42 million, was laundered through a network of shell companies, real estate investments, and international wire transfers that touched at least 19 countries across 4 continents. What made Kilauea's operation particularly lethal was their focus on fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. Fentanyl had become the leading cause of overdose death in America. According to federal health statistics, overdose deaths in Minnesota had increased by 340% between 2018 and 2024. The vast majority of those deaths involved fentanyl supplied through Kilauea's distribution network. When federal investigators calculated the direct human cost of Operation Northgate's disruption, they estimated that the operation would prevent approximately 8,000 overdose deaths over the subsequent 5-year period. 8,000 people who would have died had the cartel maintained its operational capacity would now likely survive. The trials began in May 2025. Governor Thornton faced 137 federal charges, including drug trafficking conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and operating a criminal enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming. Encrypted messages, financial records, witness testimony from cooperating cartel members who provided detailed accounts of Thornton's operational decisions. Testimony from law enforcement officers who described receiving bribes and intelligence from Thornton's office. The trial lasted 4 months. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Thornton was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. 93 of the 96 arrested individuals ultimately pleaded guilty. The remaining 3 proceeded to trial and were convicted. Sentences ranged from 18 months to 28 years, depending on the severity of their involvement and their willingness to cooperate. Of the 83 compromised law enforcement officers identified, 61 were prosecuted federally. 11 took plea agreements. 50 faced conviction. The remainder either retired immediately upon discovery or faced state-level disciplinary action. 7 officers committed suicide before facing prosecution, a tragedy that haunted the law enforcement community and raised difficult questions about accountability, redemption, and institutional responsibility. In the aftermath of Operation Northgate, significant institutional changes occurred across Minnesota and the broader federal law enforcement apparatus. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension underwent complete leadership restructuring. Multiple supervisory positions that had been compromised were eliminated entirely. A federal oversight board was established to conduct audits of state law enforcement financial records and communications. Interagency coordination protocols were redesigned to prevent single points of corruption. The DEA and FBI established a joint task force dedicated specifically to identifying and dismantling cartel infiltration into law enforcement agencies across the Upper Midwest. But perhaps the most significant change was institutional recognition that law enforcement agencies themselves were not immune to the systematic corruption tactics employed by sophisticated criminal organizations. Federal agencies began implementing aggressive insider threat programs, not in the paranoid sense, but in recognition that external enemies could and would attempt to compromise internal authority. Polygraph testing was expanded, financial audits became routine, communication patterns were monitored for signs of unauthorized contact with known criminals. Some in law enforcement resisted these changes as invasive and demoralizing, but most recognized them as necessary. The alternative was allowing criminal organizations to use the very institutions designed to prevent crime as tools of criminal enterprise. Governor Thornton's case became a watershed moment in American understanding of how sophisticated criminal organizations operate. He was not the first high-level politician to be corrupted by cartel money. He would not be the last. But he was the first to be caught and convicted for effectively allowing a foreign criminal organization to operate Minnesota as a subsidiary enterprise of their larger criminal empire. The evidence suggested that he had not simply accepted bribes, he had actually believed, or at least claimed to believe, that his arrangement with the Kilauea cartel benefited Minnesota. The state had received steady streams of money that flowed through shell corporations into infrastructure projects and charitable foundations. Employment had been created. Tax revenue had been generated through nominally legitimate businesses. From a certain narrow perspective, the state had prospered economically, even as it had been systematically corrupted. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire operation. The cartel had discovered that they did not need to maintain the fiction of a traditional criminal organization. They could simply become part of the legitimate economy. They could generate real wealth, create real jobs, and provide real economic benefits to the communities where they operated, while simultaneously using their integration into the legitimate system to shield their core criminal activities from enforcement. They had weaponized capitalism itself against the very legal system designed to constrain them. Federal investigators realized that Operation Northgate had not eliminated the Kilauea cartel. It had dismantled their North American command structure and disrupted their supply chains, but the organization itself continued operating in Somalia, Kenya, and across the African continent. The 2.64 tons of narcotics seized, the $417 million confiscated, and the 96 arrests had dealt significant damage, but they had not destroyed the cartel's fundamental capacity to generate revenue and coordinate operations across continents. Within months of Operation Northgate's conclusion, intelligence agencies began detecting signs of Kilauea reorganization and attempted reintegration into North American markets through different operational models and different corrupted officials in different jurisdictions. The investigation revealed something else that was perhaps even more disturbing than the cartel's operational sophistication. The Kilauea cartel's approach to institutional infiltration was not unique. Intelligence analysts, examining the available evidence across multiple criminal organizations, realized that this model, systematic political and institutional capture through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic placement of operatives, represented the future of organized crime in the 21st century. Traditional territorial cartels dependent on violence and visible market control were becoming obsolete. The new model was integration, invisibility, institutional capture. It required patience and capital, but once achieved, it was nearly impossible to detect or dismantle from within. The lesson that emerged from Operation Northgate was stark and unambiguous. Democratic institutions are vulnerable not only to external attack, but to internal corruption by actors willing to exploit the vulnerabilities inherent in those systems. A governor can be bought. Judges can be compromised. Federal agents can be corrupted. local police can be turned. No institution is immune if the economic incentives are sufficient and the coercive pressure is applied with sufficient skill and persistence. If you are watching this story, you understand now what was at stake in Minneapolis in February 2025. You understand that Operation Northgate was not simply a drug trafficking investigation. It was an institutional autopsy, a detailed examination of how a criminal organization had systematically dismantled the authority of the state and had begun constructing a permanent shadow government. You understand that the tunnel beneath the attorney's mansion was not merely a storage facility. It was the physical manifestation of a much larger tunnel that had been dug through the entire institutional structure of Minnesota government. The cost in human lives is difficult to calculate precisely, but the estimate is staggering. An estimated 8,000 preventable overdose deaths averted through the disruption of fentanyl supply. Countless crimes prevented through the removal of corrupted law enforcement. The immeasurable damage to public trust in institutions as citizens began understanding that the very agencies charged with protecting them had been operating as extensions of criminal enterprise. This story is a warning. Power does not always announce itself through violence and domination. Sometimes power only requires silence and ambition. It requires the willingness of individuals to prioritize personal enrichment over institutional integrity. It requires the willingness of institutions to prioritize preservation over accountability. And it requires the willingness of society to accept those compromises as inevitable rather than catastrophic. The takedown of the Kilauea Cartel's North American operations stands as a testament to what law enforcement is capable of when corruption is finally exposed and confronted. But it also stands as a warning about what criminal organizations are capable of achieving when they apply intelligence, patience, and capital to the systematic undermining of democratic institutions. This script is a fictional dramatization created for storytelling purposes only. While inspired by real concerns about cartel operations and institutional corruption, all characters, specific details, operations, and events have been invented. Governor Thornton is not a real person. The Kilauea Cartel is a fictional organization. The tunnel, the raids, and the investigation described here are dramatized narratives designed to illustrate the vulnerabilities in institutional systems. The truth is that vigilance against corruption requires constant institutional attention, robust oversight mechanisms, and the willingness of individuals within those institutions to prioritize the public good over personal advancement. Operation Northgate, in this fictional context, represents that vigilance and that commitment. The question that remains is whether such commitment can be sustained.